So this is the first video in this series for sensation and perception, and we are going to start with an introduction to perception. This is chapter 1 of the Sensation and Perception book. And what's important to start out is to understand the difference between sensation and perception, the terms. So a lot of scientists have really argued that these concepts are the same. They believe that they're essentially the same thing, and you'll find that many people use them interchangeably. But there is actually a definition for each of these, and they are two separate concepts. So sensation is one of those terms that we use to describe the physiology behind what's going on. So this is that elementary process. It occurs at the very start of the sensory system and leads to this idea of perception. And perception is this conscious sensory experience that you can talk about, that you can actually put into words. So sensation is sort of the experience before the experience, whereas perception is the actual conscious experience that you can talk about. And when it comes to this course, I will use the term perception a lot, and I won't really distinguish between the two, but know that there is a difference between the two. In this particular video, we're going to talk about this process, this perceptual process. And so I'm going to try to do these videos in kind of shorter format so that it's not so overwhelming, because sensation and perception has a lot of processes and ideas and terms and physiological processes that are really heavy. And so I want to make sure you guys aren't overwhelmed by that. So we're going to mostly focus on this perceptual process during this particular video. And we're going to start out with something as simple as the stimulus in the environment. This right here, in this case, we're going to use a tree. And in a lot of the examples I'm going to use, and a lot of this course is going to spend a lot of time on vision. And that is because if you understand the complexities behind visual processing, then you're really going to understand the underlying processes for the other senses. There's a lot of the basis is sort of the same. And so when we go through each individual sort of part in vision, we can kind of line that up with other senses, and it makes it a little bit easier to understand. So you're going to see that this course primarily focuses on vision, and then as we get towards the later end of the course, we're going to start getting into the other senses. So this particular example, again, we're going to use vision, but the perceptual process is across all senses. So we're talking about, vision, hearing, touch, smell, all of and the chemical senses, and we're going to get into this later. But the perceptual process really follows all the different sensations. So this is a 7 steps, so starting with the stimulus and ending with what are you going to do about what you have perceived. The other thing that this is going to include, so it's going to go all the way through here. We're gonna move through each of these steps individually. But one thing that I want to acknowledge here is that a big part of this process includes knowledge, and so this steps 5 and 6, perception and recognition, involves the knowledge, the what you have inside your brain. Okay. And so that is going to help you with the perceiving part, and then understanding and recognizing what it is that you are perceiving. And so we're going to start through this with steps 1 and 2. So with step 1, we're talking about the distal stimulus. So if we looked here, this being step 1, this is the stimulus in the environment. And so it starts with this distal or distant stimulus. And so anything in your environment, all objects, all things in your environment, whether they're sounds, whether they're objects for you to see, or sounds for you to hear, or things for you to touch, everything is available to you as an observer. And there's so much going on in your environment. There's just no possible way that you can understand and perceive every single little tiny thing. So if I ask you right now to close your eyes and to think about all the things that are surrounding you, and try to recall all of the things that are around you, you can probably do a pretty good job of getting all the major things in relation to where you are, especially if you're in a familiar place. But let's say we're in the classroom and I ask, well, how many bricks are in the wall? What color are the walls? You might actually not be able to recall that. But it's not like it's an empty gap in your memory. You sort of fill that in. You may even not even realize what color your walls are right now until you open your eyes and go, oh yeah, they're there. But you're not going to, have a gap in your memory here. So there's no way for us to attend to every single tiny little thing. Our attention is selective. So we're going to selectively attend to objects that we are going to, in this case, see. And so our brain does a really good job of filling everything else in that we're not really attending to. But when we talk about the sensory or sensation or perception process, we have to think about that first step, and that is that object that's there. And so in the case of vision, the object that we're going to look at, in this case the tree, it's going to impinge or make an impact on the receptors. That stimulus making an impact on the receptor is going to lead to an internal representation through a special sensory language in the brain. So the brain has to be able to decipher that stimulus or set of stimuli. It has to be able to understand what it's looking at. And so that particular tree in this case, okay, is going to do something to the receptors, which is going to result in the brain being able to understand what it's looking at eventually. Okay. So this leads us to step 2. And this says step 3, but on your slide, you'll see it says step 2. So what this is the proximal stimulus. So step 2 is the proximal stimulus that's in proximity to what it is that you're looking at. Okay. So step 1, information about the tree is carried by light. Okay. Step 2, the light is going to be transformed when it's reflected from the tree. It's going to travel through the atmosphere, and then it's going to be focused by the eye's optical system. And then this is going to result in what we refer to as the proximal stimulus. Okay. And what this means is it's in proximity to the receptors, and it now has an image of the tree on the retina, which is a representation of the tree. Okay. So remember, step 1 is there is this distal stimulus. Information is carried by light in this case, okay, for vision. The information is carried by light. Your brain does not understand light yet, okay? It needs to be transformed into a language that it can understand. So it's not there yet, okay? Step 2 here, so step 2, that light is transformed when it's reflected from the tree. It's going to travel through the atmosphere, and then it's going to be focused by the eye's optical system. And the result is this proximal stimulus, which is in proximity to the receptors. The image of the tree is reflected onto the retina, and we're going to get into all the vision specifics later. But just to understand these processes. And that image on the retina is a representation of the tree. Okay, so we're moving along and we're working toward the brain to understand what it's looking at. Okay, so step 1, we have the distal stimulus, the tree. Step 2, that light is reflected and focused, and now it's a proximal stimulus. Okay, so here we have the light is reflected off the tree. Okay, and it essentially enters into your retina and results in an image on the retina, this is the proximal stimulus. So this is a representation of that. Okay, so that's step 2. Your brain still does not understand yet what it's seeing, okay? Because it's still going through the process. And this is where we hit step 3, the receptor processes, okay? So our brain has to be able to translate this. So we call this whole idea, this principle, the principle of transformation. So this is when the stimuli and responses that are created by stimuli are transformed or changed between what we see in the environment and what we understand it is to be, okay? And this transformation process happens through transduction, okay, which we will get to and we will know in deep detail later on in when we get into vision specifically, okay? So as these step 3 receptor processes work, this principle of transformation, think of it as a language. Our brains can understand certain languages, and in the case of vision, we have very specific receptors or cells that are specialized to respond to light energy. So with vision, our sensory receptors, okay, respond to light energy. And it's able to then translate that information into a language that our brains can understand. And when it comes to all senses, we have sensory receptors for all senses, okay? They just all are specialized in their own way. So for us to be able to hear, to taste, to smell, to feel, to see, all of that requires specialized sensory receptors that are specific to that particular environmental energy, okay? So we have these visual pigment, so sensory receptors that that have a visual pigment that changes and reacts to light. And we're going to get into this process in major detail later. I just want you to kind of understand sort of the basics in terms of the steps here. But when it comes to vision, we are going to then take that information, that light energy in, and we're going to be able to translate that into electrical energy, okay? So that our neurons can then understand and then lead to our brains knowing what we're looking at in terms of perception, okay? So that light energy, okay, is going to be changed to electrical energy through transduction, okay? So when any kind of environmental energy changes to a language that the brain can understand, to these nerve impulses, okay, that is what we call transduction. And so transduction is the process that converts a sensory signal to an electrical signal, okay? The sensory signal to an electrical signal that can be processed in different specialized areas of the brain, okay? So as we go through this process, okay, in terms of vision, so in step 3 in vision, okay, we have specific special receptors in the back of the eye that are specifically shaped to react to light energy, okay? They turn light energy into that electrical energy, which our brain can then read, which can then eventually lead to perception. So in the case of vision, we have rods and cones to help us be able to take that light energy, convert it to electrical energy, and then eventually lead to this perceptual process, okay? So when we do this particular process, and again, we're going to go into super detail about rods and cones and color vision and black and white vision later. But know that as we continue through from step 3 of receptor processing, okay, we're going to move to neural processing. And neural processing is that change is going to occur as the language shifts from light energy to electrical energy, and then those signals are then going to be transmitted through the neurons. And especially when it comes to vision, there's a whole different groups and categories and types of neurons that the information has to move through in different phases and steps in order to get to, in the case of vision, the occipital lobe. Okay, so each major sensory system has a primary receiving area. And in the case of vision, we call this the occipital lobe, right? And so that is the back portion of the brain. And so if we look at this here, the occipital lobe is here, okay? The temporal lobe is the primary receiving area for hearing, so here, okay? The temporal lobe is, here, getting ahead of myself, okay? The parietal lobe is important for sensory information like touch, temperature, pain, and that's located here near the sensory motor cortex and all that, okay, which is all located in this area here. So that's the parietal lobe for skin senses, the temporal lobe for hearing, the occipital lobe for vision. Okay, and then the frontal lobe can take all this information and put it together for us to understand and perceive and use that information for understanding what we're seeing. So each sensory system has a primary receiving area, right? And that's these lobes here, okay? And when it comes to vision, this is this sort of interconnected maze of different kinds of neurons. That's a really complex network system that leads to the neural processing that has to occur for us to be able to understand and perceive what it is that we are, that in this case of vision, looking at. Okay? So, after the neural processing occurs, okay, that's when we're going to get to perception. That's when we're going to understand what it is that we're looking at. If you have damage to anywhere in the neural processing system, so let's say you have temporal lobe damage due to a stroke, okay? If you have damage to any of these particular steps, you're going to see issues happening with the person perceiving something correctly, okay? So in the case of stroke, if there's temporal lobe damage, that person might have a difficulty in understanding what they're hearing in terms of language. They may not be able to understand what a person is saying. They may have difficulty producing language, which is aphasia. And that is a problem with processing, okay? If you have damage to the receptors, so let's say there's a damage to your rods or your cones here, that again is going to change what the person perceives. And if it doesn't even get to, if there's a problem with the receptors and it doesn't even get to the neural processing, then you're not going to see the end result of perception and then later on action. The person can't do anything because they don't consciously perceive what they're experiencing. Now, the last few steps, which is steps 5 through 7, include perception, recognition, and action. So this is 5, 6, and 7, okay? When it comes to experience and action, okay, experience is a really important thing here because you have to be able to identify what it is that you are perceiving. Okay. And there's another component of this when it comes to perception and recognition where knowledge is important. And we're going to get into knowledge as its own separate thing in the next few slides. But when it comes to experience and action, those electrical signals are going to lead to us having what we refer to as a conscious experience, right? This is us being able to say, I understand what I'm looking at in the case of vision. So if a person is looking at a tree, they need to be able to recognize it as a tree. Okay, so they would place it in this particular language category. So that requires a specific cognition to be present. Okay, where the person is able to put it in a specific cognitive box. For example, you see a tree and you're going to put it into your tree category. Okay, instead of your dog category. Maybe you know a lot about trees and you can identify what kind of tree it is. So instead of just saying tree, you might say, well, that is a oak tree, okay? And that is more specific, in a more specific category than just the sort of umbrella tree category, okay? So what's important is in here is experience. You have to have some way to think about this. And even if you don't know a lot about trees, you know, you've seen a tree and you know enough about a tree to know what it is. And maybe you see something that looks almost like a bush, and maybe you are going to develop a new category of tree or bush or type of plant, let's say. You have enough experience around it to be able to understand what it is that you're looking at. Now, the last few steps here that we're going to talk about, these still talking about perception, recognition, and action, okay? When we look at something, in the case of vision, and we see something, so perception has occurred, okay, all the neural processing has finished and perception has occurred, I see something there. Recognition will occur, I identify that as an oak tree, okay? Now we can make a decision to act or not to act, okay? So let's say you want to have a closer look because you're like, oh, it's an oak tree, let's take a look. Okay, you may go back to recognition. Is it an oak tree? Oh, yes, it is an oak tree. Okay, when you recognize it's a tree, you might go back to perception by saying, well, what kind of tree is this? Let's take a closer look at the leaves. Let's take a closer look at the bark. Okay, so this is not necessarily a completely linear process. This does kind of have a little back and forth a bit. When it comes to understanding and then deciding, do I want to further on, or maybe you stop and you don't do anything else. Your last action is, oh, tree, moving on with your life. Okay. Same thing. And we can switch this to sound. Maybe you hear something and then you don't know what it is, or you recognize that maybe it sounds like an animal, and now you want to investigate further. So that recognition warrants action. What is that? Let me go find out. But this idea of perception and recognition, stages 5 and 6, that involves knowledge, okay? This right here involves the knowledge portion. And we're going to get into knowledge more specifically later, and I have a nice video after this that I want you guys to stop the video and then go take a look at this YouTube video that I have. And it's on Moodle and it's on the next slide. What I want you guys to know about knowledge is that it's that information that you bring to the situation. That's the information that you have currently as you are moving about and navigating your world. And there's an argument between scientists about, do we engage in bottom-up processing or top-down processing? And a lot of times, scientists, especially in the past, have argued that it's an either or. Either you're experiencing bottom-up processing or you're experiencing top-down processing. But really, when it comes to understanding the processes of both, I think you'll find that we do both, right? And it depends on the situation if we sort of primarily do bottom up or we primarily do top down. But bottom up processing is where we experience perception. Oh, of course, this is going to move around now. Hold on, give me one quick second. Let's start this again. What happens with bottom-up processing is that perception is what directs cognition, okay? And so the processing is based on incoming stimuli from the environment. We call this data-based processing because we take in the information first, and then we decide what to do with it. So it's driven by environmental stimuli. So for example, you hear someone calling your name, then you're going to respond to that. What? Okay. It's the sensation coming in, the information coming in, and then we then take that information, decide what to do with it. So we have a person here and they have their nice brain in here, and the sound comes into the ears, and then we understand, oh, I'm hearing something. They're calling my name. What do I want? So it's bottom up. It's bottom up processing. Okay. The sensation comes in and then it goes to the brain, and then the brain decides what to do with it. Perception drives cognition or directs cognition. Okay. Now, the next type of processing is top-down processing. And this is where we say that cognition actually directs perception. And so in this particular type of situation, the processing is going to be based on your knowledge. It's going to be based on what you bring to the situation, and it's heavily based on those cognitive factors. We also call this knowledge-based processing. So this is driven by expectation, okay? And so this would be like, for example, the person is here and they're right here, and their brain, you start with the brain and you work your way down, okay? So an example of this is you're in a dark room, you're in your room, your bedroom, and it's dark. You know your room, you have a mental map of what your room looks like, so that's going to dictate your perception prior to you experiencing it. And so your cognition is going to direct perception. That's going to direct how you act in the situation. So you start with the brain and the cognition and you work your way down. So the next slide, this is the video that I want you guys to stop and take a look, and then we will resume the other slides in another video, but I want you guys to take a look at this, and then I want you to look at the next few slides as examples. There's a couple of instructions that I have for you guys to test this out, so I want you guys to do this on your own, and then we'll pick back up on the next few slides, so that way, you know, we can kind of discuss what happened during this sort of like mini experiment and what you think is, if it's top down or bottom up. Okay, so email me if you have any questions about the content.